The freezing rain came down in sheets that November morning in 1882, turning the muddy streets of Spokane, Washington Territory, into a miserable gray slush that soaked through boots and chilled bones to the marrow. Zelda Armstrong stood on the corner of Howard Street and Riverside Avenue, her thin shawl doing little to protect her from the bitter cold, as she clutched a wooden basket filled with late-season wildflowers she had gathered from the valley before dawn. Her fingers had gone numb an hour ago, and her teeth chattered so violently she had bitten her tongue twice already. The flowers drooped in the freezing rain, their petals turning translucent with ice, but Zelda could not afford to go home empty-handed. Her mother had taken ill 3 weeks prior, and the doctor's bills were mounting faster than Zelda could count. Her father had died in a mining accident 2 years back, leaving just Zelda and her mother in their small cabin on the edge of town. At 19 years old, Zelda had tried everything from taking in laundry to mending clothes, but nothing brought in enough money fast enough, so she sold flowers. Most days, she could manage a few sales to the ladies who frequented the general store or the wives of the railroad men who had moved to Spokane when the Northern Pacific Railway came through the previous year. But today, with the freezing rain coming down and the temperature dropping by the hour, the streets were empty. Everyone with any sense had stayed indoors by their fires. Everyone except Zelda, who could not afford sense when her mother needed medicine. She had been standing there for nearly 4 hours when she heard the steady clip-clop of horse hooves on the wet street. Zelda looked up through the curtain of rain, wiping the water from her eyes with the back of her hand. A lone rider was approaching, sitting tall in the saddle despite the weather. As he drew closer, she could make out more details. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that channeled water off its edges like a small waterfall, and his long oilskin duster was beaded with rain. His horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding, looked as miserable as Zelda felt. The rider pulled his horse to a stop directly in front of her, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. He had a strong, weathered face that spoke of long days under the sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that suggested he was somewhere in his mid-20s. His eyes themselves were a striking shade of gray-blue, like the sky before a storm, and they held a mixture of surprise and concern as they took in her bedraggled state. "Miss," he said, his voice a low rumble that somehow cut through the sound of the rain. "What in God's name are you doing out here in this weather?" Zelda tried to speak, but her jaw was shaking too badly. She held up the basket instead, showing him the wilted flowers. The cowboy's expression shifted from concern to something closer to disbelief. "You are selling flowers? In this?" She managed a nod. He looked at her for another long moment, then swung down from his saddle with easy grace. Up close, he was taller than she had realized and broader through the shoulders. He smelled of leather and horse and rain. "How much for all of them?" he asked. Zelda blinked up at him, certain she had misheard. "All of them. Every last flower in that basket. How much?" She did a quick mental calculation. There were perhaps 3 dozen flowers, and she usually charged 10 cents each. $3, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The cowboy reached into his coat and pulled out a leather wallet. Without hesitation, he counted out 5 silver dollars and placed them in her trembling hand. "Take it," he said when she started to protest. "Consider the extra payment for standing out in this freezing rain trying to make an honest living." Zelda stared at the coins in her palm, feeling tears prick at her eyes. It was more money than she had made in the past week combined. "What is your name?" the cowboy asked, taking the basket of flowers from her. "Zelda," she managed. "Zelda Armstrong." He touched the brim of his hat with his free hand. "Frank Zimmerman, Pleased to make your acquaintance, Miss Armstrong, though I wish it were under better circumstances." He glanced up at the sky, then back at her. "Where do you live? I will walk you home. You are going to catch your death out here." "I cannot ask you to do that," Zelda protested, even as another shiver racked her body. "You are not asking, I am offering." Frank's tone left no room for argument. "Where?" "The east edge of town. Past the mill." Frank nodded and took her elbow with his free hand, his touch gentle but firm. "Come on, then." They walked through the freezing rain, Frank leading his horse with one hand while keeping a steadying grip on Zelda's arm with the other. She was grateful for the support because her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. The basket of flowers swung from Frank's other hand, looking absurdly cheerful despite their bedraggled state. "Have you been in Spokane long?" Zelda asked, trying to focus on something other than how cold she was. "About a week," Frank replied. "I have been working on a ranch down in the Palouse country, but the owner sold out to a big cattle company. They brought in their own men, so I have been drifting, looking for new work." "There is ranch work around here," Zelda said. "The Johnson place is always looking for good hands, and the railroad is hiring, though that is different work." Frank made a non-committal sound. "I am not much for railroad work. I prefer being on horseback to swinging a hammer." He glanced down at her. "What about you? Have you lived here long?" "All my life. My father came here in '78 when it was barely more than a trading post. He worked the mines until—" She trailed off. "I am sorry," Frank said quietly. They walked in silence for a while longer, the rain showing no signs of letting up. By the time they reached the small cabin Zelda shared with her mother, she was shaking so badly she could barely manage the latch on the gate. Frank opened it for her, then followed her up the short path to the door. "Will you be all right?" he asked. Zelda nodded, though she was not entirely certain that was true. "Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman, for the flowers and for walking me home." "Frank," he corrected. "And you are welcome, Miss Armstrong." "Zelda," she replied, managing a small smile. Frank smiled back, and it transformed his face entirely, softening the hard edges and making him look younger. "Zelda, then." He handed her the basket of flowers. "Here. I reckon your mother might enjoy these more than I would." Before Zelda could respond, the door opened, and her mother appeared. Martha Armstrong was a thin woman who had once been beautiful, but now looked worn down by illness and hardship. She wore a shawl wrapped around her shoulders and leaned heavily against the doorframe. "Zelda," she said, her voice weak. "I was so worried. Who is this?" "This is Frank Zimmerman, Mama. He bought the flowers and walked me home from town." Martha's sharp eyes took in the situation quickly. "You had better come inside and warm up, Mr. Zimmerman. It is the least we can offer after such kindness." Frank looked like he might refuse, but then Martha was seized by a coughing fit that had her doubled over. Frank made his decision quickly. "Let me tie up my horse and I will be right in." Inside the cabin, Zelda got her mother settled back in the chair by the small stove while Frank tended to his horse under the lean-to shelter beside the house. The cabin was small but clean, with just 2 rooms and a loft where Zelda slept. A fire burned low in the stove, and Zelda quickly added more wood to build it up. When Frank came inside, stamping the water from his boots, he had to duck slightly to avoid hitting his head on the low doorframe. He removed his hat and hung it on a peg by the door, then shrugged out of his wet duster. "Thank you for the hospitality, madam," he said to Martha. "Nonsense," Martha replied, though another cough interrupted her. "You brought my daughter home safe." "That deserves more than a few minutes by the fire." She turned to Zelda. "Make some coffee, dear, and there is some of that stew left from yesterday. Mama, you should not be worrying about feeding guests. You need to rest." "I will rest better knowing that young man is not going back out into that freezing rain on an empty stomach." Frank held up his hands. "I do not want to be any trouble." "It is no trouble," Zelda said firmly, moving to the small stove. "Please sit down." As she prepared the coffee and warmed the stew, Zelda found herself acutely aware of Frank's presence in the small cabin. He sat in the other chair, talking quietly with her mother about the weather and the town and nothing of particular importance. But his voice was calm and steady, and Zelda noticed that her mother's breathing seemed to ease as they talked. When Zelda brought him a bowl of stew and a cup of coffee, their fingers brushed briefly, and she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the heat from the stove. Frank's eyes met hers, and something passed between them that made her look away quickly, suddenly flustered. "This is excellent," Frank said after tasting the stew. "Thank you." They sat together for nearly an hour, talking about everything and nothing. Frank told them about growing up in Montana Territory, about learning to ride almost before he could walk, about the vast open spaces and the hard work of ranch life. Zelda found herself drawn into his stories, fascinated by the life he described. In turn, she told him about Spokane, about watching the town grow from a rough collection of buildings into something more substantial, about the coming of the railroad and how it had changed everything. Martha mostly listened, her expression thoughtful as she watched the two young people talk. Finally, when the rain began to ease slightly, she cleared her throat. "Mr. Zimmerman, where are you staying in town?" Frank looked slightly embarrassed. "I have been camping just outside town, madam. Cannot afford a hotel room right now." Martha and Zelda exchanged glances. "That is not right," Martha said firmly. "Not in this weather." "I will be fine, madam. I have slept in worse." "Nevertheless," Martha continued, "we have a small barn out back. It is not much, but it is dry and out of the wind. You are welcome to stay there until the weather clears and you find proper work." "Mama," Zelda started to protest, not because she objected to the offer, but because she worried about what people might say. "Hush, child. It is the Christian thing to do." Martha turned back to Frank. "What do you say, Mr. Zimmerman?" Frank looked between the two women, clearly torn. "I could not impose like that." "It is no imposition," Martha said. "Truth be told, it would ease my mind to have a man around the place. There is plenty of work that needs doing that Zelda cannot manage on her own, and I am in no condition to help." She coughed again, as if to emphasize her point. "Consider it a fair trade. You get a place to sleep, and we get some help with the heavy work." Zelda held her breath, surprised to find herself hoping Frank would accept. There was something about him that made her feel safe, protected in a way she had not felt since her father died. Frank was quiet for a long moment, considering. Finally, he nodded. "All right, madam. But only if you let me earn my keep properly. I will chop wood, make repairs, whatever you need." "Done," Martha said with satisfaction. That was how Frank Zimmerman came to stay in the small barn behind the Armstrong cabin, and how Zelda's life began to change in ways she could never have anticipated. The freezing rain continued for 3 more days, turning the world into a landscape of ice and mud. During that time, Frank proved to be worth his weight in gold. He repaired the leak in the cabin roof that Zelda had been trying unsuccessfully to patch for weeks. He chopped enough wood to fill the woodshed to bursting. He fixed the broken step on the front porch and reinforced the lean-to shelter so it would not collapse under the weight of snow when winter truly set in. And through it all, Zelda found herself watching him. She watched the way his muscles moved under his shirt when he swung the axe. She watched the concentrated expression on his face when he worked on the roof, his tongue caught between his teeth as he positioned each shake just so. She watched the gentleness in his hands when he helped her mother to the table for meals, supporting her weight as if she were made of spun glass. She also noticed the way he watched her when he thought she was not looking, Their eyes would meet across the yard or over the dinner table, and each time, Zelda felt that same jolt of warmth, that same flutter in her chest. It was unfamiliar and thrilling and terrifying all at once. On the fourth day, the rain finally stopped, and pale sunlight broke through the clouds. Frank came to the cabin that morning looking determined. "I am going into town to look for work," he announced. "Do you need anything while I am there?" Zelda glanced at her mother, who sat wrapped in blankets by the stove despite the relative warmth of the cabin. They needed medicine, but the $5 Frank had given her for the flowers had gone to pay their tab at the general store. "We are fine," Zelda said, not quite meeting his eyes. Frank studied her for a moment, and she had the distinct impression he knew she was lying. But he simply nodded and headed out. He returned that afternoon with his saddlebags full of supplies and a look of satisfaction on his face. "I got hired at the Johnson place," he announced. "The pay is decent, and they are letting me keep my horse there." He started unpacking the saddlebags, pulling out packages wrapped in brown paper. "I brought some things: coffee, flour, sugar, bacon, and this." He held up a small brown bottle. "The man at the general store said this medicine is good for coughs." Zelda stared at the supplies spread across the table, her throat tight. "Frank, you cannot. This is too much." "It is nothing," he said, looking uncomfortable. "Just consider it part of my rent for the barn." "The barn we are letting you stay in for free," Zelda pointed out. "For helping with chores," Frank corrected. "Which I have been happy to do, but this is different. Your mother needs medicine, Zelda. Let me help." Martha, who had been watching the exchange with interest, spoke up. "Accept gracefully, dear. The man wants to help." Zelda wanted to argue, wanted to maintain some shred of pride, but the truth was they needed the help desperately. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "We will pay you back when we can." "No need," Frank said firmly. "Just get your mother well. That is payment enough." Over the following weeks, a routine developed. Frank would ride out to the Johnson ranch each morning before dawn and return just as the sun was setting. He would care for his horse, then come to the cabin for dinner. Zelda always insisted he eat with them, and gradually, it began to feel natural having him there, filling the chair that had been empty since her father died. Martha's cough began to improve with the medicine, and some of the color returned to her cheeks. She started sitting up for longer periods, even helping with small tasks like mending or shelling peas. And she watched Frank and Zelda with an expression that was knowing and amused and a little sad all at once. One evening in early December, after Frank had returned from the ranch and they had finished dinner, Martha announced she was tired and would be retiring early. Zelda helped her into the bedroom, and when she returned, Frank was still sitting at the table, turning his coffee cup between his hands. "Your mother seems better," he said. "She is, thanks to you." Zelda sat down across from him, smoothing her skirt over her knees. "I do not know how we can ever repay you for your kindness." "I told you, no repayment needed." Frank looked up, his gray-blue eyes intense in the lamplight. "I am just glad I happened to be riding down that street that day." "So am I," Zelda said softly. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something Zelda could not quite name. Frank cleared his throat and looked away. "I should probably turn in," he said, rising from his chair. "Early start tomorrow." "Wait," Zelda said, standing as well. "I made something for you, to thank you properly." She went to the small chest where she kept her sewing and pulled out a package wrapped in cloth. When Frank unwrapped it, he found a shirt made of good sturdy cotton in a deep blue color. The stitching was precise and even the work of someone who had spent countless hours perfecting her craft. "Zelda," he said, his voice rough. "This is too much." "No, it is not enough," she replied. "You gave us so much, Frank. Let me give you something in return." He held the shirt up, and even in the dim lamplight she could see the quality of the work. "It is beautiful, thank you." "I noticed your other shirts were getting worn," Zelda said, feeling shy suddenly. "I measured one of them when you left it to dry after the rain. I hope it fits." Frank looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "You made this for me, of course. Who else would I make it for?" He took a step closer, still holding the shirt. "Zelda, I need to tell you something." Her heart began to beat faster. "What is it?" "That day I found you selling flowers in the freezing rain, I had been planning to ride through Spokane and keep going. I had no intention of stopping here." He paused, his eyes searching her face. "But then I saw you, standing there in the rain, and something just stopped me cold. I could not ride past you. I could not leave you there." Zelda found she had forgotten how to breathe. "Frank." "I know it has only been a few weeks," he continued, the words coming faster now, as if he had to get them out before he lost his nerve. "I know I have no right to feel this way, no right to say these things. But Zelda, I cannot stop thinking about you. Every morning when I ride out, I am counting the hours until I can come back. Every night when I lie in that barn, I am thinking about you just a few yards away." "I think about you too," Zelda whispered. Frank set the shirt down on the table carefully, then took both of her hands in his. His palms were calloused and rough, but his touch was gentle. "I am just a cowboy with not much to my name," he said. "But I am hardworking and I am honest, and I would do everything in my power to make you happy. Zelda, I am falling in love with you. Maybe I already have." Tears sprang to Zelda's eyes, but they were happy tears. "I am falling in love with you too," she admitted. "I tried not to. It seemed too fast, too impossible, but I cannot help it." Frank's face broke into that smile that transformed him, making him look young and hopeful and utterly beautiful. He raised her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "May I court you properly?" he asked. "With your mother's permission and everything done right?" "Yes," Zelda said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, of course, yes." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her close, and Zelda felt safer and happier than she had in years. She could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady beneath her ear, could feel the warmth of his body through the worn fabric of his shirt. "I will make you a good life," Frank murmured into her hair. "I swear it." "You already have," Zelda replied. They stood there in the lamplight, holding each other until they heard Martha cough pointedly from the bedroom. They sprang apart, both blushing, and Frank grabbed his new shirt. "I should go," he said, but he was grinning. "Before your mother comes out here with a broom." "She would not," Zelda protested, but she was grinning too. "Good night, Zelda." "Good night, Frank." After he left, Zelda leaned against the closed door, her hand over her racing heart. From the bedroom, she heard her mother call out, "Well, are you going to make me wait until morning to hear what happened?" Zelda laughed and went to tell her mother everything. Martha gave her blessing readily, though she made Frank ask her properly the next evening, which he did with endearing nervousness. From that point on, their courtship proceeded with all the propriety that 1882 Washington Territory society demanded, which meant they were rarely alone together, but found ways to communicate nonetheless. Frank would catch her hand when he helped her down from the wagon in town. Their eyes would meet across the dinner table, full of promises and plans. On Sundays, when Frank had the day off, he would escort Zelda and her mother to the small church in town, and they would sit together, their shoulders just barely touching. Christmas came, and Frank carved Zelda a beautiful wooden box for her sewing supplies, the lid decorated with an intricate pattern of flowers that made her cry when she saw it. She gave him a warm scarf she had knitted, and a pair of leather gloves she had saved for months to afford. Winter settled in hard after Christmas, bringing snow that piled high and temperatures that dropped so low the water in the basin would freeze overnight. But the cabin was warm, the woodshed was full, and Martha continued to improve. By January, she was well enough to resume most of her normal activities, though she tired more easily than before. Frank had saved nearly every penny of his wages from the Johnson ranch, and one evening in February, he came to dinner looking nervous. After they had eaten, he cleared his throat and addressed Martha formally. "Madam, I would like to ask your permission to marry your daughter." Martha smiled, her eyes bright. "I wondered when you would get around to asking. Of course you have my permission. I cannot think of anyone I would rather see Zelda married to." Frank turned to Zelda, who was sitting with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, hardly daring to breathe. "Zelda Armstrong, will you marry me? I do not have much to offer you yet, but I am saving to buy some land. I want to build you a home, start a ranch of our own. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build a life with you." "Yes," Zelda said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you, Frank Zimmerman." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "It was my mother's," he said softly. "It is the only thing I have from her. She died when I was young, but I remember she was kind and strong like you." Zelda held out her hand, trembling, and Frank slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. They were married in April, when the first flowers were beginning to push through the thawing ground. It was a small ceremony at the church, with Martha and a few friends from town in attendance. Zelda wore a simple dress of cream-colored cotton that she had sewn herself, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Frank wore his blue shirt and had bought a new pair of trousers for the occasion. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Frank kissed her gently, reverently, as if she were something precious and fragile. Zelda felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were tears of pure joy. The Johnson family, grateful for Frank's hard work and dedication, had given them permission to build a small cabin on the edge of the ranch property. It was not much yet, just one room with a loft, but it was theirs. Frank had spent every spare moment working on it, and several of the other ranch hands had helped with the heavy construction. That first night in their own home, Frank carried Zelda over the threshold, and they stood together in the center of the room, looking around at what they had built together. "It is not much," Frank said, "but it is ours." "It is perfect," Zelda replied, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "Everything is perfect." He kissed her then, deeper than before, and Zelda felt herself respond in ways that made her blush even as she pressed closer to him. They had been so careful during their courtship, so proper, but now they were married, and the constraint of propriety was finally lifted. "I love you," Frank murmured against her lips. "God, Zelda, I love you so much." "I love you too," she whispered back. Show me how much." And he did, gently and patiently, making her feel cherished and desired and loved beyond measure. In the days and weeks that followed, they settled into married life. Frank continued to work at the Johnson ranch, but now he came home to Zelda every night. She kept their small cabin spotless, cooked meals that made Frank groan with pleasure, and continued to take in sewing work to add to their savings. Martha visited often, riding the wagon Frank had fixed up for her, bringing news from town and checking on her daughter with a mother's concerned eye. She seemed to approve of what she saw, because Zelda was blooming under Frank's love and care. The pinched, worried look she had worn when she was selling flowers in the freezing rain was gone, replaced by a glow that made her beautiful. Summer came, hot and dry, and Frank worked from dawn until well past dusk. The ranch was thriving, and Mr. Johnson relied on Frank more and more. He put Frank in charge of breaking the new horses, a job that required skill and patience. Zelda would watch sometimes, her heart in her throat as Frank worked with the wild-eyed animals, talking to them in that low, calm voice until they settled and began to trust him. "You are going to give me gray hair," she told him one evening after he had been thrown particularly hard. He limped into the cabin with a bruise blooming on his shoulder and his hat crushed. "I am fine," he assured her, wincing as she helped him remove his shirt to examine the bruise. "Just got a little overconfident." "You could have been killed," Zelda said, her voice sharp with fear. Frank pulled her down onto his lap, mindful of his sore shoulder. "Hey, I am all right. I am not going anywhere. You are stuck with me." "Good," Zelda said fiercely, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Because I am not letting you go." That night, as they lay in their bed in the loft, Zelda pressed close to Frank's uninjured side and said, "I have something to tell you." "What is it?" He turned his head to look at her in the moonlight filtering through the window. "I am with child." Frank went very still. "You are certain?" "Yes, I have missed my courses twice now, and I have been feeling poorly in the mornings." She bit her lip, suddenly nervous. "Are you happy?" In response, Frank rolled carefully to face her, taking her face in both his hands. "Happy, Zelda, I am more than happy. I am thrilled." Terrified, but thrilled. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "We are going to have a baby." "We are going to have a baby," Zelda repeated, and then she was crying and laughing at the same time while Frank held her and made promises about the future they would build for their child. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall. Zelda's belly grew round, and Frank treated her as if she might break, despite her protests that she was perfectly capable of continuing her normal activities. He insisted on doing all the heavy work around the cabin, and when winter came again, he barely let her outside for fear she might slip on the ice. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Zelda complained, but secretly, she loved being fussed over. Martha was beside herself with excitement about becoming a grandmother. She came to visit more frequently, bringing things she had made or saved for the baby. She and Zelda spent hours sewing tiny clothes and blankets, planning for the arrival. In January 1884, on a cold night when the stars were brilliant overhead, Zelda's labor began. Frank rode like the devil himself was chasing him to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Patterson, from town. Martha was already at the cabin, having moved in the week before in anticipation of the birth. The labor was long and difficult. Zelda had never experienced pain like this, and there were moments when she was certain she could not endure another second. But Frank was there, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, murmuring encouragement even though he looked pale and frightened. "You can do this," he told her. "You are the strongest person I know." "I cannot," Zelda gasped. "Frank, I cannot." "Yes, you can. Look at me." He waited until her eyes focused on his. "You stood in freezing rain selling flowers to save your mother. You kept your family together when everything fell apart. You can do this, Zelda. I know you can." And somehow, drawing strength from his faith in her, she did. Just as dawn was breaking, their son came into the world with a lusty cry that made everyone in the room laugh with relief. Mrs. Patterson cleaned him up and placed him in Zelda's arms, and Zelda looked down at the tiny, red, perfect face and fell in love all over again. "He is beautiful," Frank whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He touched one tiny hand and the baby's fingers curled around his finger. "Look at that. He is so small. What will you name him?" Martha asked, tears streaming down her face. Zelda looked at Frank. "What was your father's name?" "Thomas." "Why?" "Because Thomas Zimmerman is a fine name for a fine boy." Frank's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas," he said softly. "Tommy." The baby made a small sound, as if in agreement, and they all laughed again. Those first months with Tommy were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. He was a hungry baby who rarely slept for more than a few hours at a time. Zelda walked the floor with him countless nights while Frank watched with concern, wishing he could help more. "Go back to sleep," Zelda would tell him. "You have to work in the morning." "So do you," Frank would reply, but he would eventually drift off from sheer exhaustion. Spring came again, bringing warmer weather and longer days. Tommy grew rapidly, becoming more alert and responsive. He would follow Frank with his eyes when his father moved around the room, and he seemed to recognize Zelda's voice, calming when she spoke to him. Frank had continued to save money, and in the summer of 1884 he came home with news. "I found land," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. 40 acres just west of here with good water and grazing. The owner is willing to sell at a price I can afford." "Frank, that is wonderful." Zelda shifted Tommy to her other hip. "When can we see it?" They rode out the following Sunday, with Tommy secured in a sling against Zelda's chest. The land was everything Frank had promised. Rolling hills with good grass, a creek running through the property, and a stand of pine trees that would provide lumber for building. "We could build a real house here," Frank said, his voice full of dreams. "Not just a cabin, but a house, with separate rooms and a proper kitchen. We could run cattle, maybe some horses. Build something lasting, something to pass down to Tommy and any other children we might have." Zelda looked around at the land, seeing not what it was but what it could be. She could picture the house Frank described, could imagine children playing by the creek, could see a future spreading out before them like the wide Montana sky. "Let's do it," she said. Frank bought the land in August, and the hard work of building began. He continued to work at the Johnson Ranch during the day, but every spare moment was spent on their property. Mr. Johnson, impressed by Frank's dedication and work ethic, gave him permission to use ranch tools and even sent a couple of hands to help with the heavy construction on their days off. The house took shape slowly over the following year. It was larger than their cabin, with a main room, a separate bedroom, a kitchen, and a loft that could be divided into rooms for children later. Frank built it to last, with solid timber framing and a stone fireplace that he mortared himself. They moved into the house in the summer of 1885, when Tommy was 18 months old and toddling everywhere with determined purpose. Martha came too, taking the small bedroom and insisting she could help with the children and the house while Frank and Zelda built their ranch. The first few years were lean. They started with just a dozen cattle and 2 horses besides Frank's buckskin gelding. Frank built fences and a small barn, working until his hands bled and his back ached. Zelda helped where she could, while also caring for Tommy and taking in sewing work that brought in much-needed extra money. But slowly, steadily, the ranch grew. The cattle multiplied. Frank's reputation as a horseman spread, and people began bringing him animals to break and train. Zelda started a garden that produced more vegetables than they could eat, and she sold the surplus in town. In the fall of 1886, Zelda discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Their daughter was born the following spring, in April 1887, on a day when the wildflowers were blooming across the hills. They named her Rose, because Frank said she was as beautiful and perfect as a flower. She had Zelda's dark hair and Frank's gray-blue eyes, and from the moment she was born, she had her father wrapped around her tiny finger. "I am in trouble," Frank said, holding his daughter for the first time. "How am I supposed to say no to this face?" "You are not," Zelda replied, laughing. "But that is what I am here for." Tommy was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything. He would bring her toys and pat her head gently, saying "Baby Rose" in his sweet toddler voice. The years passed in a blur of work and growth and love. The ranch continued to prosper. Frank hired his first hand in 1888, a young man named Sam who was good with cattle and grateful for the work. By 1890, they had 50 head of cattle and were known throughout the region for the quality of their horses. Tommy grew into a sturdy, serious boy who followed his father everywhere, learning the ways of the ranch. Rose was a bright, cheerful child who loved to help her mother in the garden and could charm anyone with her smile. In 1891, Zelda gave birth to twin boys, much to everyone's surprise. They named them James and John, and the chaos in the household increased exponentially. But it was a happy chaos, full of laughter and noise and love. Martha, now in her 60s, had slowed down but remained an integral part of the family. She would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching her grandchildren play, a contented smile on her face. "You have built something wonderful here," she told Zelda one evening. "Your father would have been so proud." "I wish he could have known Frank," Zelda said. "I think they would have liked each other." "I know they would have," Martha agreed. The ranch continued to grow and thrive. By 1895, Frank had expanded their holdings to over 200 acres and employed 3 full-time hands. The house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family, with rooms added for each child. Tommy, now 11, was already a skilled rider and worked alongside his father. Rose, at 8, had a way with the ranch's chickens and had taken over their care completely, selling eggs in town and saving the money in a jar. The twins, now 4, were hellions who kept everyone on their toes. In the winter of 1896, Martha fell ill with pneumonia. Despite their best efforts and the doctor's care, she passed away peacefully in her sleep one February night. Zelda was heartbroken, but she took comfort in the fact that her mother had lived to see her grandchildren grow, had died surrounded by family, and had spent her final years in comfort and happiness. They buried her on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a pine tree where wildflowers would bloom each spring. Frank carved a beautiful headstone himself, with Martha's name and dates, and the words "beloved mother and grandmother." "She would have loved this spot," Zelda said, standing at the grave with Frank's arm around her. "She loved you more," Frank replied. "She told me once that finding me was the answer to her prayers for you, that she could rest easy knowing you were cared for." Zelda leaned into her husband's warmth, grateful beyond measure for the life they had built together. The turn of the century came, bringing changes to the wider world but little difference to their daily lives on the ranch. Tommy was now a young man of 16, tall and strong like his father, with a quiet competence that made Frank proud. He had started courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a sweet girl named Sarah who blushed whenever Tommy looked at her. "He is so young," Zelda fretted. "He is the same age I was when I first saw you," Frank pointed out. "That was different." "How so?" Zelda thought about it, then laughed. "I suppose it was not, though I would like to think I was less obvious about my feelings than Sarah is." "You were not," Frank said, grinning. "You were just as transparent and just as lovely." Rose, at 13, was becoming a young woman with her mother's beauty and her father's determination. She had ambitions beyond the ranch, talking about becoming a teacher. Frank and Zelda encouraged her, setting aside money for her education. The twins, now 9, were still inseparable and still trouble, but they were good boys at heart. They worked hard at their chores and were kind to the animals and each other. In 1902, Zelda discovered to her surprise that she was pregnant again at 39. Frank was concerned about the risks at her age, but Zelda was confident. Their 5th child, another daughter, was born in the spring of 1903. They named her Martha after Zelda's mother. Little Martha was a calm baby, content to watch the world around her with solemn eyes. She completed their family in a way Zelda had not realized was needed. The ranch continued to thrive under Frank's careful management. He had developed a reputation for breeding quality horses, and buyers came from as far as Oregon and Montana to purchase animals from Zimmerman Ranch. In 1905, Tommy married Sarah in a ceremony at the church in Spokane. Frank and Zelda gave them 20 acres of the ranch to build their own home and start their own herd. It felt right, passing on what they had built to the next generation. Rose left for normal school in Seattle in 1906, determined to fulfill her dream of teaching. Frank took her to the train station, and when he came home, his eyes were red. "My little girl," was all he said, and Zelda held him while he composed himself. The twins grew into strong young men who loved the ranch and showed no interest in leaving. They worked alongside their father, learning everything he could teach them about cattle and horses and the land. Little Martha grew into a quiet, thoughtful child who loved to read and could often be found curled up with a book instead of playing outside. Zelda made sure the house was always full of books for her youngest daughter. In 1910, Tommy and Sarah gave Frank and Zelda their first grandchild, a boy they named Frank after his grandfather. Zelda held the baby and thought about the circle of life, about how she had once stood in freezing rain selling flowers, desperate and alone, and now she was a grandmother, surrounded by family and love. "What are you thinking about?" Frank asked, finding her on the porch with the baby. "Everything," Zelda replied. "Nothing. How lucky I am." Frank sat beside her, putting his arm around her shoulders. They were both in their late 40s now, with gray in their hair and lines on their faces, but when Zelda looked at Frank, she still saw the young cowboy who had bought her flowers and asked her name. "I am the lucky one," Frank said. "Every day I wake up and think about how close I came to riding right past you that day. What would my life be if I had?" "But you did not," Zelda said. "You stopped. You helped a desperate girl selling flowers in freezing rain, and you changed both our lives." "Best decision I ever made," Frank agreed. Rose returned from Seattle in 1912 with her teaching certificate and a fiancé, a young man named David who taught mathematics. They were married that fall, and Rose took a position teaching at the school in Spokane. Zelda was delighted to have her daughter close by again. The twins, now 21, showed no signs of settling down, much to their mother's exasperation. They were too busy with the ranch, they claimed, though Frank suspected they were both a little too fond of their freedom. Martha, now 9, was already reading at a level far beyond her years. Frank built her a small desk in the corner of the parlor where she could read and study, and she spent hours there, completely absorbed in whatever book had captured her attention. The ranch was now over 400 acres, with more than 200 head of cattle and a thriving horse breeding program. Frank employed 6 full-time hands and several seasonal workers. The house had been expanded again, with a proper parlor and dining room and indoor plumbing that Zelda had insisted on after seeing it in town. In 1915, the world was changing rapidly. News of war in Europe reached even their remote corner of Washington, though it seemed impossibly far away. The twins talked about enlisting, but Frank forbade it. "This is not our fight," he said firmly. "At least not yet." But when America entered the war in 1917, both James and John enlisted over their parents' objections. Zelda was beside herself with worry, but she helped them pack and held her tears until after they had left. "They will be all right," Frank told her, though his own face was drawn with concern. "They are strong and smart. They will come home." And they did, both of them, in 1919. They came home changed, quieter, with shadows in their eyes that had not been there before. But they came home alive and whole, and that was all that mattered. The ranch and the hard work of the land helped heal them, and gradually, the shadows faded. In 1920, James married a girl from town, and John followed suit a year later. Both couples built homes on the ranch, and Frank and Zelda once again gave land to their sons to build their futures. Rose had 2 children by then, a boy and a girl, and visited often with David. Tommy and Sarah had 3 children, and the ranch was always full of grandchildren running and playing. Martha, now 17, had no interest in marriage. She wanted to go to university to study literature. Frank and Zelda supported her dreams, just as they had supported Rose's. The years continued to pass, bringing more grandchildren, more growth, more changes. Frank and Zelda grew older, their hair turning white, their movements slower, but their love for each other never diminished. In 1925, they celebrated their 41st wedding anniversary with all their children and grandchildren gathered around them. Frank stood and raised his glass. 41 years ago, I married the most extraordinary woman I have ever known, he said. She was just 19, standing in freezing rain selling flowers to save her mother. I bought those flowers and asked her name, and she gave me everything. She gave me love, a home, a family, a purpose. Zelda, you have been my partner, my best friend, my love. You have made every day an adventure and every night a blessing. Here is to 41 more years. I will drink to that, Zelda said, her eyes bright with tears. Though I think 41 more might be ambitious. We will take whatever we can get, Frank replied. They did get more years, blessed years full of love and family. They saw Martha graduate from university and become a professor of literature. They saw all their grandchildren grow, and some of them start families of their own. The ranch continued to thrive under the management of Tommy and the twins, who had taken over most of the day-to-day operations as Frank and Zelda grew older. But Frank still rode out most mornings, though now at a slower pace, to check on things. And Zelda still tended her garden, though she needed help with the heavier work. In 1932, they celebrated their golden anniversary. The celebration was huge, with family and friends coming from across Washington and beyond. The house was full to bursting, and tables were set up in the yard for the feast. Frank and Zelda stood together, looking out at the sea of faces of the family they had created, the life they had built. 50 years, Zelda said wonderingly. How did we get so old? Speak for yourself, Frank replied. I am as young as the day I met you. You are a terrible liar, Zelda said, but she was laughing. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Frank and Zelda sat on their porch, holding hands in the darkness. The stars were brilliant overhead, and the air smelled of pine and grass and home. You ever think about that day? Zelda asked. The day you found me selling flowers. Every day, Frank replied. I think about how different my life would be if I had not stopped, how empty, how meaningless. I think about it too, Zelda said. I was so cold and so scared. I thought I was alone in the world except for Mama, and then you appeared, like an answer to a prayer I had not known how to pray. I was the one who got the answer to prayer, Frank said. I was drifting, lost, looking for something I could not name. And then there you were, and suddenly everything made sense. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, just being together as they had been for 50 years. I love you, Frank Zimmerman, Zelda said finally. I love you, Zelda Zimmerman, Frank replied. From the first moment I saw you until my last breath, I will love you. The years slowed but did not stop. They grew older, more fragile, but their love remained strong. Frank's hands, once so strong and capable, developed arthritis that made ranch work difficult. Zelda's eyes grew dim, making sewing nearly impossible. But they adapted, finding new ways to contribute, new ways to be useful. In 1935, Zelda fell ill. It started as a simple cold but developed into pneumonia. The doctor came from town and all their children gathered. Zelda lay in bed, weak but alert, surrounded by the family she loved. Frank sat beside her, holding her hand as he had so many times before. "You are going to be fine," he told her. "You are too stubborn to let a little pneumonia beat you." "I am tired, Frank," Zelda said softly. "So tired." "Then rest. I will be right here." And he was. He was there when she closed her eyes that night and did not wake up. He was there when the doctor checked her pulse and shook his head sadly. He was there when their children wept and held each other. Frank was 76 years old, and for the first time in 53 years, he was alone. The funeral was huge, with people coming from all over to pay their respects to the woman who had been a pillar of the community, a loving mother and grandmother, and a devoted wife. They buried her on the hill next to her mother, where wildflowers bloomed each spring. Frank stood at the grave long after everyone else had left, staring down at the fresh earth. "I will be along soon, my love," he whispered. "Wait for me." But the days stretched into weeks and the weeks into months, and Frank kept going. He rose each morning and cared for himself, and spent time with his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But there was an emptiness in him that nothing could fill. He took to walking up to the hill where Zelda was buried, sitting by her grave and talking to her. He told her about the ranch, about the children, about the memories they had made together. One spring day in 1936, Frank walked up to the hill and saw that the wildflowers were blooming. They covered the graves of both Zelda and her mother in a carpet of color. And Frank thought of that long-ago day when he had bought flowers from a desperate girl in freezing rain. He sat down beside Zelda's grave, his old bones creaking in protest. "The flowers are beautiful this year," he said aloud. "You would love them." He sat there for a long time, watching the sun move across the sky, feeling the warm spring breeze. He thought about his life, about all the years and all the love and all the blessings. He had no regrets, only gratitude. When Tommy came looking for his father that evening, he found Frank sitting peacefully beside Zelda's grave, his eyes closed, a slight smile on his face. He had passed quietly, gently, just slipped away to join the woman he had loved for more than half a century. They buried Frank beside Zelda, and the whole community mourned. The ranch went to their children, who kept it going with the same dedication and love that Frank and Zelda had shown. And every spring, when the wildflowers bloomed on that hill, people would remember the story of the cowboy who bought flowers from a girl in freezing rain, asked her name, and built a love that lasted a lifetime. They would remember Zelda and Frank Zimmerman, and they would tell their children and grandchildren about true love, about devotion, about building something lasting from the smallest beginning. The ranch still stands today, passed down through the generations, a testament to what two people can create when they love each other completely. And on that hill, where the wildflowers bloom each spring, two simple headstones stand side by side, marking the resting place of Frank and Zelda Zimmerman. The inscriptions are simple. Their names, their dates, and underneath, words that Frank had requested. He bought her flowers in the freezing rain, and she gave him everything.